On June 2, 2012, DGP, the Center for Design and Geopolitics, held its second annual conference. Entitled Designing Geopolitics 2, it was held in the Black Box Theater of Cal IT 2, the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology in La Jolla, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. I want to begin with a passage from one of my favorite writers, Italo Calvino, on networks. The inhabitants of Ercilia stretch strings from the corners of the houses, white or black or gray or black and white, according to whether they mark a relationship of blood, of trade, authority, agency. When the strings become so numerous that you can no longer pass among them, the inhabitants leave. The houses are dismantled, and only the strings and their supports remain. From a mountainside, camping with their household goods, Ercilia's refugees look at the labyrinth of taut strings and poles that rise in the plain. That is the city of Ercilia still, and they are nothing. They rebuild Ercilia elsewhere. They weave a similar pattern of strings, which they would like to be more complex and at the same time more regular than the other. Then they abandon it and take themselves and their houses still further away. Thus, when traveling to the territory of Ercilia, you will come upon the ruins of abandoned cities, without the walls which do not last, without the bones of the dead which the wind rolls away, spider webs of intricate relationships seeking a form. Within the context of design geopolitics, we need to define the network, I think, a bit idiosyncratically. It is a particular scale and kind of relations operating sometimes more locally than the city, sometimes more globally, between various objects that one network can and cannot address. So we might refer to the network then as well as a scale of habitat, of place more than of space. And like any placemaking, networks work as a kind of taking of space and of the inscription of a location, exclusive of other possibilities. Networks, in other words, dwell. Networks are composed of lines. Lines produce interiors and exteriors. Networks are not just superimposed upon territory, they produce territory by striating it. Consider, for example, the Montana East Line Telephone Association of the 1920s. Before the federal universalization of telephone line service across the vast rural areas of the U.S., farm collectives made use of a network of land demarcation and spatial interiorization already in place. That is, the miles of barbed wire that segmented the prairie. And with it, they furnished crude but effective telephony using the steel lines as a channel. In this, we see what networks always do. The network that links and integrates locations house to house in a virtual conversation is the same network that demarcates the distance and separation of each, bordering them into a series of continuous positions. At the same moment that the network collapses territory, it also produces the territorial coherency that is folding ever upon itself. Finally, one requires the other. There is a mode of the line that links two things and a mode of the line which separates them. But no real line ever does one without the other. No deterritorialization without territorialization. No placeless cloud without placeful ground. This mutual effect, the inscribing and containing of place that is also the precondition of this inversion, is a kind of nomos of the network. Networks don't just explode territory, they make it. A taking which requires, demands an image of itself. Our next speaker is Usman Haque. Usman Haque is an artist, programmer, a designer. I met him first in person at O'Reilly E-Tech conference some time ago, a serendipitous, long, ended up being a very long conversation in a cafe late at night. Spawned a conversation I hope to continue with him as well. In addition to Usman's career as a successful artist, he was also the founder of Patchbay, which became very quickly the most important open Internet of Things programming platform, which he's recently turned into something bigger than its original arrangement, which I'll let him explain. So with that, my pleasure to introduce Usman Haque, who's, by the way, joining us from London. Thank you.
Thanks, Benjamin. Yes, I remember that evening very well when we talked in that cafe. Actually, E-Tech. I don't know if people have been to it, but I was very uncomfortable there, and I actually left this gathering of all these people talking about stuff they seemed to know about, and I was walking back to the hotel and I saw Benjamin sitting in a cafe just starting to eat dinner, and I thought, I remember him. I want to go and talk to him, and we ended up having a really lovely conversation. And so I'm delighted that it sort of led to this, because I'm also very honored to be here amongst sort of friends and colleagues and people whose work, some of whose work I've followed almost for 20 years now. So thank you very much for the invitation. I am, can you pull up that image there? Just to give you some background, I'm actually trained as an architect, and so I think about space and people and the way they inhabit space and design space and things like that. And so one aspect of my work, which some people know about, is all about interactive architecture projects, usually quite large scale, often quite spectacular in the sense of being blinky, shiny, floating, glowing kind of stuff. And I very specifically decided not to show any of that here today, because what I want to talk about is spectacularization, but more specifically about data spectacularization. And that's why I'm going to be talking mostly about the motivations and consequences of Patchbay, or some people have heard it pronounced as Pashubi or Pachubi or Patchbay. There were problems in the spelling that I've lived to regret. But I'm not going to even talk specifically about Patchbay itself, but again, more about the sort of phenomena that I've seen come out of it. I want to describe some of this, again, specifically within this kind of context of the spectacularization of data, really, is specifically what I'm talking about. This is a map of the Patchbay community. Essentially, what Patchbay is you could think of it like Twitter, but instead of storing and sharing text messages coming from people, it's a platform for storing and sharing data coming from sensors and devices, weather stations, energy monitors, radiation monitors, weather stations, pollution monitors, even sort of web monitoring tools. And in a sense, it's both an infrastructure, again, a little bit like Twitter, as well as a sort of platform that other people can build applications on. Rather than being specifically text, though, it's often numeric data. So it might be about 23 degrees at this location or what have you. I built the first prototype around 2005, actually for my own purposes. I just needed a way to handle the data coming from these interactive environments that I was building. It became kind of popular amongst some friends and colleagues, so I spun off a company in 2008, built up a team to actually create this platform, and launched to the public around 2009. Last year, 2011, it got acquired by a company called LogMeIn. And while I'm still part of the team, we just launched a new version of it about 2 or 3 weeks ago called Cosm, which is a sort of new incarnation, easier to spell, only 4 letters. And it's become much more about the microcosms and macrocosms of data, rather than the Patchbay, which was the original idea of being able to plug anything into anything else. And so just to sort of round off this context, I'm actually now stepping aside from running the team on a day-to-day basis, and I'm founding a new kind of urban projects division to build projects that are operating on a kind of city scale. So the community has grown massively over the last couple of years. And we now, if you sort of compare this perhaps to the Facebook image that we saw earlier, it's not quite as impressive, but you do see very similar socio-technological boundaries being drawn here. So you'll see that Germany is absolutely jam-packed with feeds. South Africa, there's maybe a few down there. We do have a few in South America. But again, these sort of feeds are coming from the sort of largely from the technological powers. Can you go to the next tab, please? Now, every single thing that you're seeing updating here is a device somewhere in real time updating around the world. This is actually running at 1/10 the speed right now. For some reason, our internet pipe is a little bit slow. That should be saying 400 updates per second down there. But there is essentially this kind of deluge, if you like, of devices that are updating all sorts of things. There'll be energy, there'll be weather, there'll be things that people just want to measure, the number of pigeons at a particular location. There will be home automation systems. We're getting about 30 million data points per day, and it'll be sometimes parameters, as I described, but it'll also be metadata, things to do with geolocation, the way the a device has been tagged, internal temperature versus external temperature, or oral temperature versus ambient temperature. There'll be geolocation, there'll be units that are updated, and all these kinds of things. Now, the reason I launched this in the first place, and maybe we can just go black now. I got no more images. I decided to show no more images after this point. The reason I decided to launch it as a kind of public infrastructure, to be frank, I don't really know. I mean, the description has changed a lot over the years for my motivations. But at the time, actually what I'd like to do is remind you of what it was like in 1995, 96 on the web. Gray screens, blue underlined links. You probably had to spawn up a separate JPEG viewer just to see images. And it's kind of like that for this world of connected devices and objects and sensors and what have you. We don't really know what's coming next. And we're kind of doing these things because we have this intuition that it's going to be useful, it's going to be innovative, that people are going to develop new models of cooperation, possibly new business models, possibly new legal models. So all of that was there. It was at once a sociological as well as a kind of almost cultural and political experiment as much as it was a sort of technological one. But ultimately what it was all about was trying to just make it easy for people to start to share data from these devices, whether they were Arduinos or whether they were building management systems or whether they were sort of web processes, and to have within the same environment data coming from individuals as well as from companies and from cities. Because I think that what I'm really looking for is the kind of non-exclusivity of these kind of conversations between environments, if you like. So why did people end up using it? There are a range of motivations. Some people just use it because it's cool, frankly. It's connected devices, it's sensors, it's, yes, let me wire up my, whatever cliche you want to insert here, fridge, beer cooler, a garage door. Some people used it to make sense of their environment. So they would plug in their energy monitor, they'd track it over time, they'd be able to compare to other people who had sort of similar energy monitors. And that actually gave rise to commercial uses of the system. So there's an energy monitor company that made a sort of Patchbay powered device so that people could actually, without even needing to program, start to store and share their data. Some people started using the system as a way to be found. They just wanted to get the data out there, make it public, make it sort of easily discoverable, if you like. Some people, and this was a little bit creepy, were interested in the data because it provided them with market research for what came next. In other words, they were looking at the sort of repository of data, devices, and the creators of that data as an indication of what might come next. And then there were those who looked to the system as a kind of promise of knowledge. They saw that sort of deluge of data, or they see that deluge of data, and they see within it some way of capturing knowledge, understanding what's going on out there. I'm actually going to just grab my bottle of water because my mouth is getting more dry. So knowledge. And this is where the problem comes for me. You must have heard this paradigm where data turns into information, turns into knowledge, turns into wisdom. The problem for me about this is that it comes in this kind of it's basically the Enlightenment project, right? It's this idea that we're going to try and measure the world, that the universe is actually somehow measurable. And as long as we can measure everything in the universe, we can start to control it. We want to sort of have dominion over our universe. And so there's this sort of impetus to try and measure and to know every lost quadrant of our environments, of our planet, of our environment. And in this deluge of data that I showed, instead of seeing this and sort of feeling any kind of fear or intrepidation, there's this desire, oh, if only I were able to wrap my head around all of that data, if I could tame it, then I'll be able to make sense of what's going on in the world, and I'll be able to control it. And so one of the sort of outcomes of this kind of desire is a desire to represent, to map, and to record data. And it results in two specific, what I call kind of fetishes. And we kind of heard about one in the first presentation today, which is the fetish of the fire hose. And here I want to give a nod to probably a friend of some people here, Aaron Straub-Cope, who in a recent talk talked about the God fantasy of sucking on the fire hose. Because this kind of idea that you're going to attain knowledge simply by being washed over by data contains with it first the idea that the universe has ultimately knowable parameters, and that we just need to figure out what all those parameters are, start measuring them, recording them, and we'll attain enlightenment. The second sort of assumption of this kind of fetish is that through the kind of dominion or through the control of all of these parameters, that we'll have certainty, right? We'll sort of take away all that worry and fear about what comes next. And the third assumption is that the data is somehow impartial, and we can point to it and say, I didn't make any ethical decision, it's in the data. You just need to look at the original source, right? That it's all in the data. So that's one of the fetishes that I bristle at a little bit. Not that I would bristle at fetishes normally, but to each his own. The second is the fetish of the pixel. And here I'm kind of setting my sights on this terrain known as data visualization. And the underlying assumptions I see in that tendency are, first, this idea that Cartesian geometry is actually an appropriate way to represent other domains. The second is this kind of, and here, this really is a fantasy. It's the fantasy of infinite dynamic range. Because what you almost always see in a sort of data visualization exercise is there's this massive data set that's stretching from here to here. But if I look at that bit, that'll convert into a beautiful image, right? That'll map. If I map the bottom to red and the top to blue, then I'm going to get a good spread. If I mapped red to blue using the whole thing, then I wouldn't really end up with a very interesting visualization. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select where my dynamic range actually is in order to represent what actually looks best. And I guarantee you that's what happened in that Facebook image that was looking at the connections between things, right? I think in the presentation it was actually mentioned that it was, you had to balance for the penetration, I think it was, of technology within the countries. The third sort of underlying assumption of this kind of fetish of the pixel is that actually it's appropriate to translate from one medium to another, that it is appropriate to make an analogy that is measured in one way and representing it in 2 or 3D, or in some cases 4D in the other side. The problem for me with all of this is that this kind of spectacularization of data, which is, on the one hand, sort of reveling in the complexity and the chaos and the cacophony of the data, as well as then showing sort of beautiful representations of it, kind of says, to my mind, there's this really complex stuff out there, but the experts are going to help you solve it. And those experts might be scientists, they might be urban planners, or very often they might actually be artists, frankly. And I'm as guilty of this as as anyone, of sort of taking data and trying to make sense of it through a representation. But the issue for me is that in any kind of data visualization process, I do not think it's either useful or complete until first you, the viewer, the spectator, because it usually is you as a spectator, are able to understand how you can affect or contribute to the data that's being represented. And secondly, how you can read any effect of what you then contribute to this kind of visualization process. So any kind of static visualization to me is merely a sort of sketch on the back of an envelope or even a cave painting compared to what it could or should be. The scariest thing about this kind of tendency, and here I admit I'm being sort of polemic, as Benjamin has asked us all to be. The scariest thing about this kind of tendency, which you could almost think of as a kind of neo-positivism, is when it's applied to the kind of design and manipulation of our cities. Because the cities are where most of us are living these days. The cities are where we are sort of building our lives. And the cities are basically what are going to be affecting the way we live. And if you listen to the discourse of Cisco with its smart and connected communities, or IBM with its smarter planet, or Philips with its controllable traffic lights that make you look at the road in front of you to see whether there are any cars coming from the right. All of their discourse is based on this idea of efficiency, right? They're making the city more efficient. They're going to be making it, you're going to get to work on time. You're going to use less energy. Things are going to be more predictable. Frankly, what they're designing are systems for homogeneity, which is directly counter to what actually makes cities sustainable in the first place, which is that they are actually engines for sustaining and supporting and encouraging heterogeneity. So in a sense, that kind of discourse of this sort of, let's just measure everything so that we can then start to control it, results in a kind of what I would consider an unsustainable way of managing and operating our cities. And, you know, kind of in a more frightening way, that discourse sounds exactly the same as the discourse that we heard from urban planners in the 50s and 60s, who were talking about efficiency and, you know, we're going to make the cities work better and, you know, and they gave us highways and high-rises, which many of us now are sort of scratching our head and thinking, how did we end up in this kind of situation? So there is an alternative, which is what I would hope to be pursuing. And the alternative is not to look at the data, not to look at this kind of deluge, this kind of onslaught of parameters or what have you, but to look at the people who are generating that data and to look at the processes they're using. So instead of looking for knowledge, look for learning and teaching, which is a very different kind of way of approaching this kind of measuring process. Think about the crafting of data. Data's not out there just to be plucked randomly from wherever you happen to, I don't know, swoop your butterfly net. Data is actually created because there are infinite parameters. You know, we can come up with parameters just to measure this room infinitely. It's not just about the temperature, the humidity, the light level, the electromagnetic fields, the warmth. It could be about the embarrassment level. It could be about the love connections between two people. It could be about, you know, the number of whatever, alpha waves, blah, 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 right? There are infinite parameters to be measured. And that is actually the human creative act, is in a sense to come up with new parameters. There are things that can't even be measured or quantified. There are things that you don't even know about. There are different ways, even if you chose temperature to measure here, even if you chose ambient temperature specifically in centigrade, Celsius, to be measured, there are dozens, if not hundreds of different ways to measure, different techniques, different tools that would come up with slightly different measurements. And so there is no consensus of data, is really the point of what I'm trying to make. When you think about data this way, then what you start to do is you start to think about the process of measuring being more about conducting experiments And everyone can be part of the process of conducting experiments. And that's really what I'm interested in, is when you get people, citizens, non-technical people. I sort of flash my fingers up here in inverted commas, because ultimately the process of measuring, I think, has got to be about making hypotheses about the world and then testing them and acting upon those hypotheses to see whether what you'd hoped would be or what you thought might be actually is. And being able to then evaluate the change that ensues from your actions. When you actually go through that process of crafting data, and you're basically going through the same processes that so-called scientists go through, you start to understand that in data, you identify patterns. You actually make the patterns. You figure out the bits that actually stick out at you. You get to understand outlier points. You get to understand what is the relevant data. You get to understand this idea of accuracy and reliability. When you're actually measuring things yourself, you understand things like dynamic range or the importance of context. Ultimately, the really important thing for me is that by going through the process of measuring you yourself, your body, your environment, your neighborhood, your city, your planet, or what have you, you can start to question the standards of evidence. And this is particularly important in the context of climate change, because at the moment, citizens are largely required to look at a politician, a scientist, a media figure, or a religious figure and trust one of them. And basically what they do is they kind of, it's a little bit more sophisticated than this, but you're basically figuring out whose evidence you're going to trust. And rather than being part of the process of actually saying, well, let me create my own evidence, let me sort of test my own hypotheses, you're relegated to this position again of kind of spectatorship and just sort of choosing which team to back, as it were. Now, what I'm trying to describe here is taking a step beyond having these digital devices that are measuring us or measuring our environment on our behalf, and to think more about the capacity of people who are actually, they are the sort of engines for computing complexity, to measure and to evaluate and ultimately themselves to aggregate a collective understanding of what's going on. So I'm not talking about the quantified self here. I'm talking more about quantified selves in a kind of quantifying world. And taking that even a little bit further, starting to think not just about humans as sensors, but biosensors. The old kind of idea of the canary in the coal mine that acts on our behalf and that computes multivariate environmental inputs in order to help us make a decision. Now, you can, these days, in fact, this is an example Natalie Jeremijenko would have made if she were here, where mice cohabit. They eat the same food. They breathe the same air that we breathe because they live in our homes. And they are experiencing many of the same things. They can act as our proxies. Why not measure them in order to understand our environments? So what we need to do is, on the one hand, develop tools for dealing with this kind of heterogeneous data, because ultimately it's always going to be heterogeneous. And I think there are mathematical tools, but there are also sociological and cultural tools for trying to make sense of heterogeneous data. I don't think that the ultimate aim should be to try and get a kind of homogenizing system, because I just don't think that we can solve the world's problems through this kind of reductivist approach where we're trying to get to a state where a single individual can even understand what the problem is, right? It was the simplification of issues that, I would argue, actually resulted in many of those problems at first. We said, oh, it's easy, you just dig up more oil, then we got more energy, then we can grow. Oh, damn, didn't realize, because I didn't have the expertise to understand the climate implications that this might be. And so I'm questioning why it should be that we try and tame that complexity in order to simplify it, just so that single individuals can know or understand what's going on. I think that the problems or the kind of issues that we're faced with have indefinite parameters, and they demand solutions that are probably so complex, that they're going to require cooperation between people who don't agree and never will agree. They're going to have understandings about the issue that they'll never be able to explain to each other, because we just don't have big enough brains to comprehend all the sort of intricacies, the sort of interdependencies. And finally, that are sort of known, that are kind of necessarily so intricate that they're going to require more than one person to tell the story. And so, ultimately the whole point of this is to think about the process of crafting data and measuring and processing as this kind of collective action. And there is no sort of one story that comes out of it. Thank you.